Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In today's episode, we will share some true taxi horror stories that will remind you late nights, empty streets, and the promise of a ride home. But what if the journey becomes your worst nightmare? But before starting the video, please consider giving us a like. Also, if you have any terrifying or unnerving experiences of your own, feel free to reach out and share your story with us. Who knows, it might even be featured in one of our future episodes. Now turn down the lights, grab a blanket, and prepare yourself. It was nearing midnight, and Ravi was wrapping up a long shift. The streets were unusually desolate, as if the entire city had fallen asleep. His cab rolled slowly through the foggy lanes, the headlights cutting through the haze like knives. Ravi's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he checked the time on the dashboard. 11:43 p.m. One more ride, he thought. Just one more. As he passed an old streetlight that flickered ominously, he saw a figure standing motionless on the curb. The man seemed to appear out of nowhere, emerging from the shadows. He wore a long overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat, his face hidden in the dim light. Ravi hesitated for a moment. Something about the man felt off. But fares had been slow that night, and he didn't want to go home empty-handed. He pulled over. The man opened the door and slid into the back seat without a word. The faint scent of wet earth filled the car, as though the man had been standing in a graveyard. "Where to?" Ravi asked, glancing at the rearview mirror. The man's voice was low, almost a whisper. "The old railway station." Ravi stiffened. He knew the station well. It had been abandoned for years after a fire destroyed most of it. Locals said it was haunted, but Ravi dismissed such talk as superstition. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Are you sure about that? There's nothing there," Ravi said, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. His silence felt heavy, oppressive. Ravi decided not to push further and started the car. As they drove, Ravi noticed that the usual hum of city life was absent. No other cars, no distant sounds of people, just an unsettling silence. The fog grew thicker, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly. Ravi glanced at the rearview mirror again. The man's face remained obscured by shadows, but Ravi could swear he saw the faint glint of eyes watching him. "Are you from around here?" Ravi asked, his voice breaking the silence. The man tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question. Finally, he spoke. "I've been here a long time." The way he said it sent a chill down Ravi's spine. He focused on the road, but his mind raced. The atmosphere inside the car felt heavier with each passing second. When they reached the station, Ravi was relieved to stop the car. The building loomed ahead, its crumbling walls covered in ivy. The air felt colder here, as if the place itself was devoid of life. The man reached into his coat pocket and handed Ravi a coin. Ravi frowned. It was an old, tarnished coin, unlike any he had seen before. It felt icy against his skin. "Wait here," the man said, stepping out of the car. Ravi watched as the man walked toward the station, his figure disappearing into the fog. He waited for what felt like an eternity. Minutes turned into an hour, then two. Ravi honked his horn, but the sound seemed swallowed by the fog. Finally, he decided to check the station. As he approached, the rusted gates creaked open with an unsettling groan. Inside, the place was a graveyard of forgotten memories. Broken benches, shattered windows, and graffiti scrawled across the walls. "Hello?" Ravi called out, his voice echoing in the emptiness. No answer. He wandered deeper, his footsteps crunching against debris. Then he heard it, faint footsteps behind him. Ravi spun around, but no one was there. Panicking, he ran back to his car. Once inside, he reached for the coin the man had given him. To his horror, it crumbled into dust. The next morning, Ravi told his story to a friend, who listened in stunned silence. "You don't know?" the friend said. "A man died in that station fire years ago. They say his spirit still tries to find his way home." Arjun had been driving all day, weaving through crowded streets and noisy markets. By the time night fell, he was exhausted. He decided to take one last ride before heading home. As he drove through the outskirts, the urban lights faded, replaced by stretches of open fields and dense trees. It was just past midnight when he saw her. A woman standing by the roadside. She wore a white sari, the fabric fluttering lightly in the breeze. Her long black hair partially covered her face, but even in the dim light, Arjun could tell she was beautiful. He slowed down and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" The woman nodded silently and got into the back seat. "Where to?" Arjun asked. "Pandari village," she replied softly. Then after a pause, she added, "No matter what happens, don't stop." Her words sent a ripple of unease through Arjun. "Is everything okay?" he asked. She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The route to Pandari village was through a dense forest. The trees on either side formed a canopy, blocking out the moonlight. As Arjun drove, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, he noticed movement in the corner of his eye. Shadows flitted between the trees, quick and silent. Arjun tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Are there animals here?" he asked, trying to mask his fear. The woman remained silent. A few minutes later, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. It was a man, standing completely still. His face was obscured by darkness, but Arjun could feel his eyes watching them. Instinctively, Arjun's foot moved to the brake, but before he could stop, the woman spoke, her voice sharp and urgent. "Don't! Keep driving!" Heart pounding, Arjun pressed the accelerator. The car surged forward, and the figure vanished. As they continued, strange whispers filled the car. They were faint at first, like wind rustling through leaves, but they grew louder. Arjun couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unsettling, angry, desperate. And finally, they reached Pandari village. Arjun stopped the car, his hands trembling. He turned to speak to the woman, but the back seat was empty. He froze. The door hadn't opened, and there was no way she could have left. Confused and terrified, he checked the back seat. That's when he saw it. Words scratched into the leather. "Thank you for saving me." The next morning, Arjun returned to the village to ask about the woman. The villagers told him about a bride who had died tragically on her wedding night. Her spirit, they said, wandered the forest, searching for someone to take her home. Deepak had always been a confident driver. As a taxi driver for nearly a decade, he'd seen it all. Drunken passengers, late-night fights, and eerie, empty roads. But nothing had prepared him for the night he took the wrong turn. It was around 11:30 p.m., and Deepak was heading back home after a long shift. The city was unusually quiet, the streets empty save for the occasional stray dog or flickering street lamp. He was tired and eager to get home, but a wrong turn on a poorly lit road put him on an unfamiliar path. "Shortcut," he muttered to himself, trying to justify the decision. His GPS was glitchy, refusing to load the route, but Deepak figured he could find his way back. The road was narrow, and lined with tall trees that seemed to lean inward, creating an oppressive tunnel. The further he drove, the more his confidence waned. The headlights barely illuminated the winding road, and every shadow seemed to move. That's when he saw him, a man standing by the side of the road, waving his arms frantically. Deepak slowed down. The man looked disheveled, his clothes torn and his face streaked with dirt. He appeared injured, one arm hanging limply at his side. "Help me," the man called out, his voice hoarse and desperate. Deepak hesitated. Picking up strangers at night wasn't always safe, but this man genuinely seemed to need help. Against his better judgment, he stopped and rolled down the window. "What happened? Are you okay?" Deepak asked. The man nodded weakly. "I was in an accident. I need to get to the hospital. Please help me." Deepak opened the back door, and the man climbed in, groaning in pain as he settled into the seat. "Which hospital?" Deepak asked, starting the car. "Nearest one," the man replied, leaning back with his eyes closed. His voice was barely audible, as if he were on the verge of passing out. Deepak glanced at him through the rearview mirror. The man's face was pale, and his breathing was shallow. "What kind of accident? Were you in a car crash?" Deepak asked, trying to keep the man conscious. The man didn't respond immediately. After a long pause, he whispered, "It wasn't just me. There were others." Deepak frowned. "Others? Should we go back and check if anyone else needs help?" "No," the man said sharply, his eyes snapping open. "Just drive, please." The urgency in his voice sent a chill down Deepak's spine. He pressed the accelerator, the car picking up speed. The road ahead was darker now, with no streetlights to guide the way. As they drove, Deepak couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air inside the car felt heavy, and the faint smell of blood lingered. He adjusted the rearview mirror to get a better look at the man, but froze. The back seat was empty. Deepak slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. His heart pounded as he turned around, expecting to see the man slumped over, but there was no one there. The seat was empty, save for a dark, wet stain that hadn't been there before. "What the hell?" Deepak whispered, his breath quickening. He got out of the car, shining his phone's flashlight on the back seat. The stain was blood, fresh, bright red, and spreading. Panicking, Deepak looked around, but the road was deserted. There was no sign of the man. "Was I imagining it?" he muttered, trying to convince himself it was all in his head. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the forest. It sounded like metal being crushed. Deepak's head snapped toward the noise, and in the distance, he saw a faint glow. Hesitating, he decided to investigate. As he approached, the glow grew brighter, flickering like firelight. Then he saw it, a mangled car wrapped around a tree. Smoke billowed from the engine, and the smell of burning rubber filled the air. Deepak's stomach churned as he realized the car looked familiar. It was an older model, the kind he'd seen around town. The driver's door was flung open, and the ground was smeared with blood leading away from the wreckage. He turned back to his car, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But before he could move, he heard a faint voice. "Help! Me!" The voice was coming from the wreckage. Deepak froze. It was the same voice as the man who had been in his cab. Summoning his courage, he moved closer to the car. The driver's seat was empty, but the passenger seat was drenched in blood. His phone's flashlight caught something on the dashboard, a cracked photo frame. It showed a man smiling with his family. Deepak recognized the man instantly. It was the same man who had been in his back seat. A shiver ran through Deepak as the realization hit him. The man was dead. he hadn't survived the crash. The whispers started then, faint at first but growing louder. They seemed to come from all directions, filling the air with unintelligible words. Deepak spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The shadows seemed to shift, closing in on him. Panicking, he ran back to his car and jumped inside, locking the doors. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as he started the engine. The headlights flickered before stabilizing, and for a moment, Deepak thought he saw the man standing in front of the car, staring at him. Then he was gone. Deepak floored the accelerator, speeding down the road without looking back. When he finally reached a main road, he pulled over and tried to catch his breath. His hands trembled as he looked at the bloodstain on the back seat. The next day, Deepak went to the police station to report the incident. The officer listened quietly, then handed him a file. Inside was a photo of the man from the car crash. "This is him," Deepak said, pointing to the picture. The officer nodded grimly. "He died 2 weeks ago in an accident on that road. You're not the first driver to report seeing him." Deepak's heart sank. He never drove on that road again.